appointed a resident group to a finance committee to study how the city should address the expiring potential Headley override millage in fiscal 25. And so we've worked together on a week-by-week basis from September through early January. And they have finished their report and are here tonight to present that recommendation. I have the honor of introducing Quinn Zeagler, a prominent resident of many commissions, and I do appreciate her role as chair of the committee. So Quinn, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for having us here this evening. Like Joe said, we are here to talk about the voted city operating millage, which is commonly called the Headley override, because it expires at the end of next year. So this committee of residents was convened to study how a renewal or non-renewal would impact city staffing and service levels, and how a renewal or non-renewal would impact the progress towards the recommendations of the facilities task force. There are 10 residents on this committee, many of whom are here with me this evening, and collectively we spent hundreds of hours learning about the issues, really diving in, asking questions, and self-education as well. I'm going to hit as many high points as I can this evening, and we're going to jump into it, starting with some background.
Through the chair, Quinn, could we please just, I'd love to ask anyone who volunteered to stand up and acknowledge yourself, please.
Right.
Hi, guys.
Thank you. So Ferndale collects property taxes, but it does not keep all of those dollars. It collects a portion of the funds to other jurisdictions. Property taxes are calculated based on two values. The first value is the taxable value of your home, which starts at 50% of your purchase price. It typically goes up based on inflation or 5%, whichever is lower, but it can go down, such as in the case of a recession. The other factor that goes into your property taxes is a millage rate, or mills, which is essentially a multiplier. And if you're like me, you like to see an example. So this is my house. I have a taxable value in 2023 of $134,380, and the Oakland County millage rate was 3.9686 mills. We multiply those two numbers together, divide by 1,000, and you can see that in the check I wrote to the city of Ferndale, Ferndale then took $533.30 and gave it to Oakland County. Now, there are certainly other millages on your taxes. You can find them on your tax bill and the lovely insert that the city puts together. There are other taxes for Oakland County, or millages, I should say, for Oakland County, the public school, the library, and a host of other things. A few more terms we need to know: Proposal A and the Headley Amendment. Now, these are both state laws. Proposal A limits the annual increase in taxable value at each property to inflation or 5% per year, whichever is lower. And the Headley Amendment does something similar, but it does it for the entire municipality. Now, the combination of both of these laws together means that recovery from recession is slow, because there is no longer a mechanism for cities to capture tax dollars at the same rate as economic recovery. And we saw this happen during the Great Recession. It started in 2008, and Ferndale did not return to the same taxable value until 2020. Meanwhile, the economy as a whole had generally recovered by around 2015. And in the time that it took Ferndale to recover, the producer price index for asphalt used in road paving had gone up by 60%. We also saw increases in things like fuel, labor, construction, etc. So in 2020, Ferndale had the same tax base that we did in 2008, but the price for the things Ferndale buys had gone up considerably. Now, there was another big change that happened in these intervening years, and that was the Headley override. So let's define that as well as a Headley rollback. You can find this image in the report. This is a sample city containing just 4 homes, and I want to zoom in on years 3 and 4. In year 3, one of the properties sells. So in year 4, the taxes become uncapped and go up considerably. You'll notice that the property taxes for the unsold homes in year 4 go up by 5%. Now, what this means is that if the millage rate had remained at 15 mills, the sum total of all of the properties in year 4 would exceed the threshold allowed by the Headley Amendment. Therefore, the millage is rolled back to 14.4 mills. This is a Headley rollback, and I should mention there is no mechanism by which the millage would naturally go back up again. So the new money collected from the uncapped home is essentially redistributed to all of the homes in the form of a millage reduction. That's why we see the unsold homes saw their taxable value go up by 5%, but their tax bill only went up by 1.4%. What this means is that when we see a large number of uncapped homes here in Ferndale, it does not result in a windfall of money for the city for precisely this reason. So in the face of a millage that can only go down and has no mechanism for recession recovery, what residents can do is opt for a Headley override to voluntarily bring this millage back up. Once it's brought up, rollbacks resume and start going down again. Separately, Proposal A and the Headley Amendment are reasonable policies. Together, they hurt Michigan cities. But until there's change at the state level, residents in cities like Ferndale have used the Headley override to ensure that there is adequate funding for their communities. So speaking of communities, this is our community. This is the General Operating Fund, and it's about $26 million. The money that comes into this General Operating Fund is coming from property taxes, state revenue sharing, grants, and some other smaller sources. In terms of expenditures, you can see that about half of the budget goes towards police and fire, and if you sum across all of the departments the personnel costs, you would find that 70% of the budget is spent on payroll and things like benefits. If the Headley override is to expire and no replacement source of funding is found, approximately $4 million will need to be cut from this $26 million budget. There have been past changes. Restructuring took place in 2020 following the start of the recession, and it resulted in severe cuts to staffing, including our public safety team, as well as pay freezes, reduced services, and programming. Now, voters did approve the Headley override in 2010 and again in 2015, and those funds were deployed to backfill jobs and to modernize city services. So based on the fact that we had restructuring less than 15 years ago, and the money that we do have today is providing us with modern services, we can start to understand the issue and why this committee of residents was convened. So this committee looked primarily at 3 scenarios. There are more in the report where you can find them side by side. Scenario 1 is no renewal of the Headley override. It is simply allowed to expire. Scenario 2 is a renewal of the override and maintains approximately the same millage amount. Scenario 3 resets the millage to the charter amount. And we can see each of the millages here. Again, scenario 1 with our current city operating and no override, scenario 2 with our current operating and current override, and scenario 3 with that reset. You can see the math and the change from 2023. I have to point out that Headley rollbacks will continue to affect every millage on this chart. There is no floor to protect Ferndale's ability to fund operations at a minimum level. Without voter approval for an override or reset, based on current state law, over time, the total operating mills will approach 0. And that might be okay if our economy only ever goes up. But when there is a recession, if our total operating mills are low, we will repeat the same experience, the cuts, and the deficit that we saw in 2010. So let's talk now more about scenario 1. You should know that the Headley override accounts for 2.2 to 8.6% of the total mills on your combined tax bills. The reason that that's a range is it depends on what school district you're in and whether or not you have a primary residence exemption. The remainder of the charges on the tax bill, the other 90+%, are unrelated to the Headley override, and they will not change as a result of any decision to renew or expire the current override. So last year, I paid $7,052 in property taxes, and of that, $586 were for the Headley override. The other 90%, approximately $6,400, is not going to change as a result of any decision to renew or expire. Now, I'm one data point, and we need to be very careful when we're talking about anecdotal data because everybody's situation is different. And that's when it can become really useful to look at overall trends here in the city. And what we find is that 63%, a good majority of folks, are paying less than $330 per year toward the Headley override. And when I say less than, there are a good number of folks paying less than $100 per year. Another 27% of residents are paying between $330 and $545 per year. So just these two segments make up 90% of the population. Now, we can also therefore say that if the Headley override is to expire, 90% of residents would see savings of less than $545, some significantly less so. But with a reduction in property tax revenue comes an impact on city services. So a non-renewal, as I said, would reduce the general operating fund by approximately $4 million. So what this committee did is we reviewed the priority-based budget to understand the consequences of what our recommendation might be. Now, I need to be clear that our understanding is recorded here because it informed our thinking, but it was beyond our scope to recommend specific cuts. One of the ways that you can look at the priority-based budget is based on mandate. So does the city have a federal or state mandate to provide services, a self-mandate, or no mandate at all? And in my mind, it makes the most sense if you're going to cut, start looking at things with no mandate. And that looks like things like Parks and Rec, including all programming, the dog park, and the maintenance of our green spaces. Communication and outreach, including the website, newsletter, and social media. City staff retention programs like professional development. And we have to acknowledge that elimination of programming also results in the layoffs of people and the loss of institutional knowledge, which is really hard to put a price on. And you could completely eliminate everything in this column, and you are not at $4 million yet. You need to keep cutting. So we look at things in the self-mandate column, and that looks like things like public safety, the maintenance of our buildings and vehicle fleet, including police, fire, and DPW. Special event management affecting things like Pride, the art festival, the Dream Cruise. Maintenance and landscaping of our downtown core, which would undoubtedly affect our small businesses. Community engagement, fall leaf removal, neighborhood traffic calming, street sweeping, and urban forestry. Everything in this column would need partial reductions, complete elimination, or outsourcing. And if you sum up the mix of those options in column 2, plus the complete elimination in everything in column 1, now you are at $4 million. So this committee's understanding of no renewal, the property tax bills would go down slightly, and services would be decreased, eliminated, or outsourced in ways that result in less local control, like our animal control department. And if additional funding is secured at a later date after cuts have already been made, the damage will be hard to undo. The quality of life here in Ferndale would be dramatically reduced. So scenario 1 is a disinvestment scenario, and I want to transition us to looking at scenarios that maintain or improve services here. To do that, we need to talk about what Ferndale residents love about Ferndale and what they feel is worth keeping. And we do that by looking at the Cobalt Community Survey. And in this statistically significant survey, over 90% of respondents said that it was very or somewhat important to sustain service levels and to implement the recommendations of the facilities task force. And just under 90% said that it was important to hire and keep good employees. So when we look at these responses and others in the Cobalt survey, priorities start to become clear. Ferndale residents want a vibrant business district, recreation for all generations, responsive public safety, special events, and urban green spaces. These services are the core of what Ferndale residents love about Ferndale, and based on survey results, appear willing to continue to fund via their tax dollars. So scenario 2, as I said, renews the millage amount at the current level. Property taxes and city services would remain about the same in the short term. Due to the limit in annual property tax growth as well as other inflationary pressures, cuts would be needed in the near future. There would be no significant capital investment in our buildings and no new or expanded services like those identified in your strategic planning meeting on Saturday. In scenario 3, if City Council and voters opt to approve the charter millage, residents would see a small increase in our property tax bill. 63% of residents would see an increase of less than $300 per year, or about $25 per month, and for some the increase would be less than $100. All told, 90% of residents would see an increase of less than $500 per year, or about $42 per month. So this committee's understanding of renewal is that it maintains current services. And scenario 3 in particular enables funding some of the priorities from the strategic plan. Things like construction of a new recreation center and combined public safety headquarters, a police co-responder program, monthly and annual financial reporting for residents to improve transparency, local drop-off sites for hard-to-recycle events, and things like rat control. Scenario 3 could also enable better maintenance of our buildings. We heard after the facilities task force report that some residents said, Ferndale should have maintained these buildings better. And yeah, we should have, but we cannot change the past. We can only make better decisions moving forward. And if we're going to make better decisions, we have to fund better decisions. So let's now talk about those buildings. In 2022, a group of residents, much like this group before you today, formed the Facilities Task Force. And this group looked at the maintenance needs of the buildings, as well as things like the equitability of the facilities in terms of male and female facilities, looked at health and wellness aspects, accessibility, and a few other things. And they looked at numbers in a few different ways. Now, a repair-only option gets you a building where the air handler runs and the roof doesn't leak. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that building still maintains the support for the people and the processes that they're putting into place in that building. And I want to put a really human face on this, because a lot of times we think of a building as a place that we just walk through, and we need to think about it differently. When we went to one of the fire stations, we went upstairs into the living quarters, and you can smell the vehicle exhaust up there. This is where our firefighters are eating, sleeping, exercising, and training. And I don't know about you, but I would not be able to do my best work in an environment like that. And for a city building a new fire station today, you are not allowed to build living quarters above the vehicle engine bay for precisely that reason. So we really do need to look at options that add a little bit more space so that we can address those and other issues. And that's why the task force looked at a repair and expansion and a replacement, which also includes a little bit more square footage. And what you see is that those dollar amounts are very similar. So this committee's understanding of funding the task force recommendations is funding is not currently available, and some major building needs are being deferred until funding becomes available. And as we all know from our own homes, maintenance needs do not go away if you ignore them. They get worse and they get more expensive. This committee also focused on the need for adequate maintenance going forward. The industry standard for facilities maintenance is 2 to 6% of the budget. Ferndale is currently funding 0.5% of the budget. So clearly there is a discrepancy there. And all of this leads us to our recommendation. As Ferndale residents who have spent months and hundreds of hours studying this issue, we recommend that City Council consider a Headley override millage to reset the city to its charter amount for the November election. And we do this because it meets resident expectations about what it's like to live in Ferndale, maintaining current services, improving services like those discussed in the strategic plan, and making our city more attractive to new talent who works in highly competitive fields, supporting the retention of existing staff, ensuring basic features and a safe and equitable working conditions, and making sure that we're maintaining these buildings for generations to come. There is a minority opinion recorded in the report. This opinion is in agreement for calling for a Headley override, although they preferred a different millage amount. So this opinion is for a scenario about halfway in between scenarios 2 and 3. It should be noted that this option will be insufficient to address the recommendations of the Facilities Task Force, but it does enable some improvements while maintaining current services. We were all in agreement on 4 things, though. That was for smarter spending, making sure we're looking at the dollars that we're spending and using them in the best possible way. Seeking alternate sources of revenue to reduce dependence on future overrides, drafting an economic incentives policy, and providing additional education for prospective homebuyers so there's no surprises when they receive their first tax bill. Now, I understand for next steps that council will decide whether or not to put a millage question on the ballot. I encourage you to consider publishing a list of the programs that will be cut to balance the budget if voters choose not to renew a Headley override, as well as initiatives that will be prioritized if voters approve a renewal or a reset. This will enable voters to make an informed decision at the ballot box. And for residents who are listening, I encourage you to read the report, share it widely, and of course, to vote. So with that, I understand that we do have some time for questions. If residents have questions, I encourage you to call the city manager's office. But if you feel more comfortable talking resident to resident, my email address is here for you. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mayor.
Thank you, Quinn, and committee for a very thorough report. You really laid it out for us